as Yates has suggested, I want to talk today about my project which I've been working on, which is around the idea of the commons, and really how we can think about it ethically. Those ethics are broken down into a number of different ideas, one of which is anti-individualism, which I'll talk about today. So that's where I'm focusing on. It's part of a broader suite of ideas which links to some of my thinking about creativity and the commons. So hopefully you'll get a sense of that as I go through. And also just to sort of say, I have written some stuff down just to sort of, because it's a fairly long talk, I want to make sure I was directed and pointed. The pictures and the slides I show are sometimes related, sometimes quite abstractly related. They're just sort of guides, so if you don't get the immediate relation, please don't worry. They're just sort of things to look at when I start to inevitably bore you. So, I think it's no secret the works and the philosophies of a certain Ayn Rand, who's an American, Russian philosopher and novelist, have had a profound impact upon our world in the 21st century. Conservative politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in the States, including Paul Ryan of the Republican Party, and in the UK, our recent Chancellor, Sajid Javid, they all openly cite Ayn Rand's work as highly influential in their political outlook. Some of them regularly admit to reading two of her most famous books, The Fountainhead, which was made into a film, and Atlas Shrugged, which is perhaps her most famous piece of work. And they admit to reading it to themselves and to their team. And even the sort of personified apotheosis of anti-intellectual populism, Donald Trump, has admitted that The Fountainhead is one of his most favourite works of fiction, although whether he read it himself or someone read it to him is unclear. But perhaps more importantly, Ayn Rand's work is said to have had a big influence in the lives of some of Silicon Valley's sort of most famous potentates, people like Steve Jobs, Peter Thiel, Travis Kalanick, and others, Elon Musk. They all, at some point, expressed their admiration for the work and the thinking of Ayn Rand. And in Atlas Shrugged, in the most famous book, the hero of the story, a guy called John Galt, proclaims got a famous, not very long speech in this book, and he says, "By the grace of reality and the nature of life, man, every man, is an end in himself. He exists for his own sake, and the achievement of his own happiness is his highest moral purpose." End quote. And his whole speech really is essentially Ayn Rand's manifesto for something that she calls objectivism, which is the reality of, which suggests that the reality of the world can be directly perceived, and that any morality and social form therefore must stem from the self's own perception of that reality. So in essence, objectivism eulogizes selfishness as the driving force of a fairer society. It rejects community, religion, and government as they leech from the power of the individual, and they act as checks on the true potential of man. So it's easy to see why such a philosophy is attractive to technology entrepreneurs, career politicians of the right, and not just because of the sort of highly masculinist language which exists. Objectivism essentially gives a moral pass, I think, for selfishness and sociopathic tendencies, and it allows for anyone trying to advocate for another form of social organisation to be labelled as a prophet of doom, perhaps. So this belief in the emancipatory power of the individual over the straitjacketing of the collective is a fundamental kernel of the kind of free market neoliberal capitalism that the paragons of the new form of authoritarian populism are trying to lead us towards. Yet I think it's the kind of thinking that has not only catalysed our current tumultuousness, it is wholly, really unqualified to counter it. So the toxic mix of an economy of technological determinism that entices us to be more introverted, competitive and singular, with government policies that remove welfare and social security and encourage the privatisation of pretty much everything, has created a world which any kind of connection with someone else has become a transaction, which you mentioned in that quote. And so even some of the most intimate encounters we have as individuals with someone else is cast as one which the individual benefits. In other words, how I relate to and belong to the rest of our species becomes first and foremost the question of what do I get out of this? And so the first part of this talk, what I really want to try and do is to chart the history of this kind of thought, from ancient Greece right away through to Trump. But in the second part of the talk, what I want to do is to think about how we can perhaps think against that, against anti-individualism, and create a world in which the injustices of that contemporary capitalism are kind of countered, and how this Randian sort of self-interest in individualism needs to be completely admonished from the central streams of government thought, business, and society in favour of anti-individualism. And furthermore, I think a radical anti-individualism is the seed of a new form of creativity, one that can begin to foster a world in which the collective is cherished by sort of empathetic encounters that we can have with one another. In other words, the creative energies that are currently directed towards rewarding the self, if shared, can be directed towards rewarding everybody to a far greater degree. But to first admonish individualism, I think it's important to know its kind of ideological roots. Ayn Rand's work and the sort of broader philosophy of neoliberalism is perhaps at its zenith, but it has a long history that has defined our morality really, for multiple millennia. I guess going all the way back to the Neolithic age, if you're honest, but where I'd like to start is in ancient Greece. So this is Thucydides. Thucydides, he was a sort of an Athenian general, heavily involved in the Spartan War in the 5th century BC. He's kind of considered the father of political realism. He saw individualism as the driving force of his generation's civilization. His view of Athenian democracy was one where the strong should rule the weak, as only the powerful had the necessary qualities to lead society progressively. He was also a staunch realist, I guess he was an objectivist, believing the world to be made up of observable phenomena strictly focused on cause and effect, and he disregarded any kind of extra perspective phenomena. That kind of put him at odds with a lot of his contemporaries, actually, in denying the existence of gods, but also made him a pioneer of empiricism and modern scientific methods. So Thucydides' his political and philosophical view on the importance of self-interest as the driving force of progress, democracy and civilization was a sentiment that influenced a number of key thinkers of the Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment thinkers of that time were sort of reacting to the dominance of the church and their doctrinal view of sort of humans' submission to a divine ruler. That all of humanity was kind of fallen and salvation was only bestowed upon and by this deity was seen as sort of antithetical to this group of Enlightenment thinkers, and it sort of denied the innate ability of humans to forge our own futures. So it's easy to see why Thucydides' ideology of rationalism and self-interest began to percolate all through the centuries and the generations to some of the key thinkers of the Enlightenment, people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, and some of the scientific theorizations through Galileo, Newton, and Christopher Wren. Now, I don't have the time or indeed the inclination really to delve into the countless incredible scholarly analysis that occupy entire library shelves and the dusty subterranean computer servers that are devoted to the intricate nuances of these thinkers and their sort of theoretical minutiae. But suffice to say, and I don't think it would be too glib of me to say that many of these Enlightenment thinkers, although by means not all, utilize the sort of progression of scientific, philosophical, and or mathematical scholarship to question the role of faith in their societies, and the majority, again, not all, championed human nature and creativity as a source of civilization, freedom, and progress. Humans in this idea were rational, empirical, they were inquisitive, they were autonomous, ultimately capable of forging their own path in life. And the individual was the master of his or her, but of course at that time in his own fate. So these philosophical ideas sort of matured through the subsequent centuries, and with the sort of rapidity at which Europe was industrializing and plundering the rest of the world, they began to infiltrate through economic thought under the sort of vernacular of liberalism. This was obviously most articulated, sort of most famously by Adam Smith, when he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And in that, Adam Smith argued that if everybody acted with self-interest, then an invisible hand will guide us all to the liberty and to the sort of more socially desirable ends. Progress, therefore, could only be achieved if we acted with self-interest. Indeed, he argued, and I quote, "By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it." So Adam Smith was clear that by being self-interested in one's own security and gain, society will be promoted and more effectually progress and liberty will prevail ultimately. And this obviously occurs through the sort of Thucydidean notion of the strong, i.e. the most competitive, gain all the resources and become the most powerful. So those are the ones that are therefore best suited to allocate resources thereafter, which I guess is a sort of precursor to this idea of the trickle-down effect. So Adam Smith dismissed overt and sort of conscious attempts at social provision, such as large government, and he sort of was ineffectual and a waste of resources. And this invisible hand metaphor, which he uses kind of only really a handful of times in his writing, actually, but it's been used most vehemently by modern-day economists as a means to describe the efficiency of market provision. So, in fact, despite Adam Smith's articulation of an invisible hand benefiting all strata of society, over the years it's been used as shorthand really for the naturalisation or the naturalised mechanics of the market. And subsequent neoclassical and laissez-faire economics has distilled Adam Smith's liberal theory of self-interest as the naturalised way in which supply and demand, when attuned efficiently to people acting as homo economicus, they should all form the basis of sort of modern socio-economic provision. So if we all acted with economic rationality and self-interest as our motivation, then that's how society will progress. And in so doing, rational logic kind of was eclipsing spiritual faith as the naturalised order of social progress. So such ideas were becoming mainstay and depicted here in 1837 by the publicist Gabriel Trudlier. And indeed, liberalism and a naturalisation of economic forces and competition became further entrenched in societal and political discourse with the impact of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Of course, Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, radically altered the entire landscape of biological and scientific work, and obviously still does today. But its impact in political and economic philosophy is actually equally as seismic. Darwin, as I'm sure you'll be aware, saw evolution as a product of survival of the fittest, and is first and foremost predicated upon competition. It is unclear whether Darwin was influenced by Adam Smith or not, although there is some reference to Adam Smith in Darwin's later work. But he often refers to the economy of nature, Darwin, or economy of nature. For example, in chapter 4 of The Origin of Species, Darwin states, and I quote, "All organic beings are striving to seize on each place in the economy of nature. If any one species does not become modified and improved in a corresponding degree with its competitors, it will be exterminated." So Darwin's use here of the language of economy is perhaps just mere wordplay, but his ideas really began to influence and in some sense justify Smithian-style economics. So if the progression of the natural world, i.e. animals and plant species, was ruled by fundamental law that emphasised the strongest, the fittest and the most adaptable species, then it should apply to human socio-economic laws ipso facto. The natural world worked, and it worked well. Not unlike a beehive, which you see here, it was regular, mechanic, beautiful and efficient. Our economic and social systems would therefore extol similar qualities if it used the same logic. The mechanisms of supply and demand, labour and the distribution of wealth became extensions of the natural order of things. So in effect, economics had become naturalised, and Darwinian's logic of self-interest as the key to societal progress became a universal truth. Faith in a supernatural force, or indeed the collective that governs all of society, was therefore unnatural, irrational, and illogical. And then the rise of sort of international mercantilism sort of actualised many of these economic truisms. It proliferated the opportunities to exact many of these economic ideals across vast distances. And the large global companies that rose, they came about with these massive financial gains. The East India Company, for example, at its zenith, had a global share, global share which Jeff Bezos had only dreamed of. At their highest, they accounted for nearly half of the world's trade, and did so through the intense trade of imported goods, mainly for India. Enacting the basic principles of self-interest and competition, the company became a key actor in the expansion of the British Empire and was an instigator of many colonial battles and wars. Global trade with goods from the Far East, the Americas, India and Australia fueled the growth of markets for more decadent items in Europe and ushered in the dawn of contemporary globalization. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution allowed for more efficient production of manufactured goods, thereby expanding the opportunities for market growth even further. And then, of course, once the United States entered global trade during the turn of the 20th century, modern capitalism has spawned a near global ubiquitous marketplace. So at the epicenter of this sort of market expansion was the philosophy of Thucydides' core belief that self-interest was the only way to progress as a civilization, because more wealth equals more civilization. The economic systems that built up around this core belief, the processes that powered the expansion of markets and the importance of private ownership, and the belief in the natural reallocation of wealth or trickle-down effects, they were all central tenets of the progression of capitalism in the 20th century as it spread around the globe. The individual mattered, essentially, more than the whole that they created. However, the incorporation of this ideology into economic systems was not always so smooth. There was a series of crises in global capitalist systems throughout the first half of the 20th century. They began to destabilize the foundational beliefs in its kind of robustness. Clearly, the Great Depression of the 1920s in the US showed that capitalist systems founded on mercantilism could fail, resulting in gargantuan levels of national debt in the Western world, massive unemployment, deprivation, and starvation. The subsequent rise of fascism in Europe in obviously World War II were also seen by the Smithian devotees as outcomes in the decline of civilization's belief in the centrality of self-interest and free market capitalism as the guiding hand of progress. So the onset of political meddling by sovereign states, or perhaps by the too hasty implementation of Keynesian economic policies, talking about Keynes, after the Great Depression and post-World War II, this meddling was characterized by bureaucratic over-bureaucratization, state management structures, nationalized investment in infrastructure, the welfare state, and notions of the social that began to encroach upon the perceived smooth functions of the economics of self-interest. I guess we see that today with the critique of the Green New Deal by the Republican Party in the States. Such processes, I think, were inefficient because they were anti-competitive. This is what these people kind of put forward. If Smithian and Darwinian economics taught us anything, it was that unregulated and unfettered competition was the import of societal progress. If the markets failed to provide for, it wasn't because they included systemic inequalities. Instead, failure of the market was purely down to their manipulation into a more socialized or to a more common goal. In other words, they weren't being selfish enough. So when self-interested individualism propelled economic growth and created vast surplus wealth, sort of globally mobile of the population, it had not really infiltrated political and or social life, at least not as yet. Overly bureaucratic states at the time in post-World War II were operating under the same logic, and they were started hampering further growth and progress. So in order to overcome this, the logic of competitive self-interest that existed in the economic world needs to be extended further beyond that into the heart of government, society, and indeed into culture itself. The ideology of the self and that emancipation was via your own actions. That had to become pervasive across society. We could all be heroes, if only for one day. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot about David Bowie's lyrics, and actually something he went through a very kind of sort of self-interested lyrical phase in this. If you go and read the lyrics on all of this stuff, it's quite weird. Anyway, so this is why neoliberalism comes in. So that was the view of people like Friedrich Hayek. He was a sort of prominent member of the Chicago School in the 20s and beyond, a sort of foundational body of scholarship of neoclassical economics. So Hayek was a key protagonist of many of the Chicago School's main outputs that saw creeping socialization of markets as something to be resisted. So the social and political, and of course the collective consciousness, was to be kept separate from the economic self-interest. The conflation of the two is what produced the ills that plagued Europe and other kind of US systems at the time. Hayek, along with many of his peers, including Milton Friedman and other important figures, they were sort of adamant that the autonomy of markets, driven by total self-interest, was a revival of the liberal project articulated by people like Smith, Hobbes, and Thucydides. So Hayek's insistence upon self-interest and individualism as a path of freedom was highlighted in his most popular work, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944, and is a fundamental kernel of what we think of as neoliberalism today. So competition, as Hayek was at pains to point out, and again I quote, is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without coercive or arbitrary intervention or authority. So everyone who enters into competitive negotiations is given a chance to decide on whether the resultant gain is worth the risk connected to it. Competition, to Hayek, was the mechanism by which self-interested motivation can forge a path of freedom and to liberty. It was how newness and progress was to be achieved. For Hayek, again, he said competition was a discovery procedure. So this philosophical viewpoint was obviously a revival of the liberal project. But it would be a kind of a stretch to say it was neoliberalism as we understand it today. That the neo bit, I guess, pertains to a much broader set of ideologies that really utilises Hayek's basic assumptions, but brings them to force upon concepts obviously beyond economics. So the political theorist Wendy Brown, she does a very intricate discussion of neoliberalism, and she argues that it configures human beings exhaustively as market actors. So essentially, neoliberalism seeks to bring the autonomy of market mechanisms to bear on non-market institutions and non-economistic happenings. So such an extension of the market is the sort of neo in neoliberalism because it's the liberalism project the liberalism project separated out the social and the political from the economic and sought to evaluate them differently. But neoliberalism extends the logic of competition as the most effective allocation of resources beyond economics to the social and to the political sphere. And in so doing, it reduces that social and the political to a single economic concept of value, one that can be exchanged under the mechanisms of competition. So neoliberalism must be reducible to the calculative mode allocation that the market has perfected. Every decision made in our lives, be that at work, at home, in leisure, emotional, even unconscious decisions, becomes an exercise in cost-benefit analysis. So the intellectual project on defining neoliberalism is obviously vast and ever-changing. There's lots of people who write about it. Will Davies got an excellent book out last year called Nervous State, which talks about it. And really, they all argue that the ideology is quite place-specific and it mutates across space. In the UK, obviously, which is my main area of research, the application of neoliberalism is most associated with Margaret Thatcher, who became the UK Prime Minister in 1979. Now, she was a keen admirer of John Hayek's book, citing The Road to Serfdom as one of the most influential books of her primacy. She would often slap it down on the desk in cabinet meetings, apparently. Her Conservative government set about enacting extremely kind of neoliberal policies very swiftly and very abruptly, collectivised under the term Thatcherism. First, national and public bodies were sold off, the first of which was British Aerospace in 1981, then British Telecom, Jaguar, British Gas, British Petroleum, British Airways, National Rail, Royal Mail, and blah, blah, blah. And many of these sort of floated on the stock exchange and sold to private investors. Such an undertaking, obviously, was a key Thatcherite policy. and had distinct overtures of Hayek's philosophies of sort of increasing market rule in everyday life. Now, the rationale behind these actions, according to Thatcher, was one of raising public funds, which is obviously the main narrative of privatisation in the form of austerity, but also was of increasing efficiency, because market mechanisms and self-interested competition were the keys to unlocking increased productivity and resourcefulness in these institutions, otherwise burdened by bureaucracy, political blockages, and stated inefficiencies. Indeed, Thatcher, like Hayek, saw these virtues as critical to social life. She famously said there was no such thing as society. But this quote is actually often taken out of context. It comes from an interview Thatcher gave to the Women's Own magazine in October 1987. And in it, she castigates people who look to the government to solve their own personal problems. So people who are homeless, for example, will then look to the government to house them, or people who get a grant to cope with the problems they have. She bemoans these individuals looking first and foremost to the government and not to themselves for help. And this is a quote which I will read for you. She said, "These people are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first." And then it goes on. It says, "There is no such thing as society. There is a living tapestry of men and women and people, and the beauty of that tapestry and the quality of our lives will depend upon how much each of us is prepared to take responsibility for ourselves, each of us prepared to turn around and help by our own efforts those who are unfortunate." So her notion really that there is no such thing as society then really is the belief that individuals must look to themselves first before thinking of others. Her articulation of the family as an important institution echoes her sort of flavour of traditional conservatism and adds a further dimension to the neoliberal mix of sort of pure capitative interest, given that the nuclear family and their sort of kept homes are sort of staunch pillars of kind of traditional UK conservative governments. But the family, as we'll see, is sort of quite antithetical to neoliberalism. Indeed, Thatcher she based her 1979 election campaign on the fact that, as a woman, she knew how to run a household budget, so she could therefore run the country's budget just as efficiently. This is obviously a chronically flawed metaphor. A national budget is the same as a household budget, just the two are completely different. But it's still a metaphor that is relevant today. And hence the family unit sort of was, and it still is, an important tenet in conservative, and I guess neoliberal sort of political economic strategies that adhere to this kind of mindset. But her remit was one of the sort of total imposition of Hayek's sort of neoliberalism, and its cornerstone of individualism and competition on all aspects of social life, including family. So rather than seeing the economic kind of separate from political, social and cultural life, which obviously hampers growth and hampers profit, Thatcher wanted to kind of export market logics of competition to all corners of life. So the very idea of society to her, and indeed collectives, and indeed the commons, had deleterious and damaging effects on the power of individualism as an ideology of progress. So hence, her remit was to impose market logics and languages onto as many different institutions and realms as possible, including the family. So if every facet of life was kind of governed by this neoliberal ideology, where would the sort of alternative modes that go against this ideology gestate? Indeed, she coined the phrase, "there is no alternative," shortened to TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. And that's kind of been utilised as a motif for sort of the belligerent belief that marketised competitive self-interest is the only way forward. And I think she summed it up in an interview she gave to the Sunday Times in May 1981. And she said that economics is the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. And I don't think there could be a more apt soundbite, really, to exemplify Thatcher's kind of belief in the ubiquity of market ideologies and obviously their implementation into ever deeper recesses of family life. Now, of course, Thatcher's brand of neoliberalism wasn't the only one. It was mirrored, obviously, by Ronald Reagan in the United States, and he obviously was a fellow devotee of Hayek's work. He was sworn in January 1981, after which he went about enforcing Reaganomics, which I guess is the sort of the similar mirror image of, mirror image in terms of being in the United States, of Thatcherism. And it involved large tax cuts, the reduction in government spending. So much like Thatcher, it was kind of a belief in a trickle-down effect. Such a belief was actually evident in his political career. 2 decades before his inauguration, he said in one of his convention speeches, he said, "We must reject the idea that every time a law is broken, society is guilty rather than the lawbreaker. It is time to restore the American precept that each individual is accountable for his actions." And then, of course, when he became president, it came through in a lot of the policies that he implemented. So the dismissal of the social as a viable realm to be nurtured and protected kind of formed the foundations for his economic and social policies once he was in power. In one of his most famous speeches, it's not actually on TV, it was on a radio address in May 1983, he said this. He said, when small business people invest their money, they have no guarantee of a profit. They're motivated by self-interest. But that alone won't do the trick. Success comes when they can anticipate and deliver what you, the consumer, wants, and they do it in a way that satisfies you. Entrepreneurs intuitively understand one of the world's best-kept secrets. Capitalism begins with giving. So according to Reagan, entrepreneurs fuel the growth of capitalism by giving their time, their resources, and their human capital. But really, this is just a mere pseudonym for calculated risk-taking. If allowed to flourish, entrepreneurs will invest all they feel they can risk, thereby providing opportunities for others in the form of employment, consumption, opportunities, and sort of other positive externalities. Classic trickle-down economics. So Reaganomics really was therefore, like Thatcherism, an attempt to create a taxation and a fiscal environment in the United States that allowed the competitive power of self-interest to thrive. And overall, in this instance, encouraged risk-taking. It would be like the American dream. And it dismissed governments that sort of hoard, ration, and control. So by cutting taxes, he was attempting to stimulate this risk-taking practices of entrepreneurs by kind of increasing their potential rewards. If they gain more control over by which the means and money kind of flows downward through things like monopolies, lobbying power, and ever more control of sort of the whole financial system, then their self-interested ideology will only see them sort of flow backwards and redirect them back to themselves. If you create a tax system which allows monopoly, then that's obviously through the ideology of self-interest, is what will eventually happen. So like Thatcherism, Reaganomics was a suite of economic policies that put competitive self-interest sort of before a notion of a common society, be that through a family, be that through a government, or whatever kind of institution you create. So what really dominated, so this brand of kind of neoliberalism, I guess, was not really confined to political hues. While Thatcher and Reagan were traditionally conservative, actually, in the end, this neoliberalism led into all sort of strata of the political spectrum. Bill Clinton's Democratic Party and Tony Blair's New Labour were sort of the next governments in the US and the UK, respectively. And I guess they recast traditional leftist kind of parties, although whether the Democratic Party were ever traditionally leftist is another argument. But they kind of recast them as more business-friendly and amenable to neoliberal policies. So capitalising upon the sort of shifting trends of deindustrialisation and the rise of the knowledge economy and indeed the creative industries, they fully embraced sort of neoliberal ideologies. It added a kind of veneer of of social sympathies so as to garner the public vote and hence obviously sweep into power. But despite this rhetoric, they continue to champion self-interest via the language of entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity, disruption, and deregulating markets, particularly to the banking industry, which is one of the main benefits of these policies. So, as history showed, these policies inevitably lead to a crash, right? And obviously in 2008, after the financial crash, neoliberal ideologues were able to sort of point to the failure of their opponents, all the while engaging in disaster capitalism. So using the aftermath of the economic catastrophe of the financial crash, they deregulated even further. They decreased social welfare by austerity and paved the way for new populist sort of neoliberalism that has seen the rekindling of kind of fascism all the way to the most powerful office in the world. It wasn't just in the US and the UK. After the financial crash, the EU's austerity hit Greece very hard, Italy, and many other countries as well. So in this new sort of perhaps more sort of intense neoliberal world post the crash, when a lot of those neoliberal ideologies have been imprinted even further, we see a revival of this influence of Ayn Rand and other sort of neoliberal ideologies. Her objectivism, her ideas are clearly aligned with neoliberal thought and Hayek's fundamental beliefs, but Rand would go a step further when it comes to the interference of government and any collective or organised forms of morality. Indeed, in 1981, 1 year before she died, she denounced Ronald Reagan's presidency. She took aim at his alignment with what she called the moral majority, namely the religious right, that was made up of the core base, and indeed against people like Trump's core base as well. And she decried this as an unconstitutional union that was a threat to capitalism. So the use of anything other than the individual as a steer of progress was to Maya a quote, God, family, and the traditional swamp, is what her words were. And in the aftermath of the financial crash, with the crisis of the globalised kind of Clinton-Blair style of neoliberalism giving rise to populism in the US and Europe, Rand's ideas are finding new traction. So as we careen into this for the third decade of the 21st century, the neoliberal project that started nearly, I guess, half a century ago really, is far from being dead, as many commentators would say. It is just simply changed, simply mutated. And I think forming an alliance with the ideology, it formed an alliance with the ideology that is most readily concerned with its survival, i.e. the populist authoritarian right. It is still fundamentally concerned, though, with the individualisation of life, because socialised anti-individualism is the death knell of profiteering. As Jameson famously said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. So beginning with facsimiles, there has been a long line of ideology that, from a position of power, have massively altered governance systems in favour of promoting self-interest. The logic of the market, of competitive individualism, of entrepreneurialism, and neoliberalism has pervaded national policies across national politics across the world, and it continues to do so today. We can see Cuba renewing diplomatic relations in the US under Obama in December 2014. That's seen a reduction in trade embargoes and obviously inward investment from US corporations. And it just goes on further today. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the demise of the USSR was for many, not least Reagan and Thatcher, the final nail in the coffin of a perceived communist alternative to capitalism's global dominance. So today, neoliberal capitalism, with its embedded market logics, individualism, and self-interest, is almost totally ubiquitous. That is an accepted natural truth of life. It is ushering in, obviously, a climate catastrophe, as we know, political unrest, health pandemics, mental health epidemics, and the rest. And of course, as Jameson argued, it is easier to manage the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Indeed, as Thatcher used to say, there is no alternative. So, that's individualism. And thinking about the ways there are no alternatives. But I think for all the pontificating by philosophers, for all the posturing of politicians, for all the crowing of these corporations, there is very much an alternative. Questioning the pervasiveness of individualism and self-interest as the only path of societal progress and enlightenment, much like the Turner Prize winners last year did, when the shortlisted artists collectively took the prize, all this kind of collectivism goes against all the political, economic and cultural narratives that we see and we hear on a daily basis. In respect to how anti-individualism can be considered an alternative ideology to today's kind of neoliberal capitalism, I think it's important to turn to the work of the anarchist philosopher Peter Kropotkin. It's particularly important because he devoted the majority of his life to the study of mutual aid. He wrote a book in 1902 called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, and actually focused on Darwin's theory of evolution, but it questioned competitive self-interest as the driving force of evolution in the animal world. And indeed, he's considered the godfather of geography, because he wrote a book about what geography ought to be, so us geographers do like the bottom one. Essentially, he was clear about evolution, that there was a common cooperation and collaboration and socialization, and that was the main way that species evolved, as well as competitive self-interest. So he was clear that there was a sort of a common humanity that we can recognize at an unconscious level, and this can indeed and should propel us to be selfless, thereby fueling equality. So for Kropotkin and lots of anarchist thinkers of his ilk, the universal sort of human solidarity was a force that can drive human progress because it was a force of evolution. And one that can overcome the individualism that was rife in the political and societal theories of the time. So his ideas are clearly in opposition to those at the core of the neoliberal project of the 21st century. Mutual aid and its kind of rejection of Darwinian self-interest as the force of evolution and therefore sort of civilization is therefore an important ideology in the ethics of anti-individualism because it allows us to consider the rights of others as equal and as important as our own. However, with the continued dominance of self-interest, government systems in our 21st century, the complete naturalization of market logics by neoliberal thought, and of course the failure of communism, mutual aid was kind of relegated to an outdated, unrealistic utopian ideal that could not form the basis of any kind of societal progress. So to realise a world beyond this self-interested world which I've painted, I think there's a need really to actively shun the self-interest that Thucydides first opined. Indeed, we need to discern what we exactly mean by the word we. You know, who is included, who isn't included. If we are we, who are they? Would Donald Trump, for example, and I'll pick on Donald Trump, but he's easy target. So what would Donald Trump, a person who is largely seen as kind of completely antithetical to this kind of collaborative ideal, could he ever be considered part of this we? Could anybody who engages in genocide ever be considered to be part of the shared resistance to global injustice? To delineate between us and them, with righteousness, morality, and progress on the one side, and violence, greed, and self-interest on the other, is to run counter to the ethics of this anti-individualism. Hence, to think of a common world with a common humanity is to recast these divides along ideological lines rather than personal lines. Anti-individualism is exactly that, to reconceptualize the individual as part of a collective humanity. Donald Trump, all of his lying, his violence, his ignorance, his hypocrisy, his insults, his racism, his sexism, his ableism, and everything else, he shares a common humanity. What an ethical understanding of anti-individualism, what it entails, is to ensure, with force if needed, that the ideology he espouses is not elevated to one of the highest offices in the world. What is needed is to recalibrate the dominant narrative so his views are not even given a platform at all. Having a social system that is based on rampant self-interest has allowed Trump and all the ills and the evils which he has bestowed upon this world to rise to the top. Creating a common world could change all that. Through a collective will and a desire to maintain anti-individualism, such a hateful and diabolical ideology would never, ever be given the oxygen to thrive. And so people like Trump would just fade away. The institutions that were once built in common, the media, legal, educational, the government, they would never, indeed, by the very common fabric, they could never allow hateful, violent, or genocidal ideologies to exist if we manage to build our institutions upon this common goal. The task then of the we is it requires the efforts of everybody. So we know what this is, we know what this we is. So how do we get it and how do we understand it? Is there a science of the we? John Donne famously wrote in 1624 that no man is an island. Nearly 400 years later, it is becoming apparent through some in-depth scientific studies just how prophetic these words were. Because the philosophies of mutual aid, despite being antithetical to contemporary narratives of development, is actually finding new favour within the neurological and the physiological sciences. In particular, there have been advancements and of the beginning in scientific writings that are beginning to counter self-interest and individualism and competition as naturalised laws. And actually, they're beginning to realise that humanity actually exists in common. There is a materially existing we. So, for example, the discovery of mirror neurons in the brain has radically altered the way that psychologists view Darwinian evolution. Mirror neurons are those parts of our brain that respond to the actions of others, and they fire up when we mimic or imitate those actions. The discovery of these neurons has far-reaching ramifications, the most prescient of which is that they call into question this Randian premise that we are all selfish beings. In effect, the actions of mirror neurons solve what commonly known as the problem of our minds, which asks how does one share mental states with someone else, and make shared empathetic relations possible? The answer, it seems, lies with the presence of mirror neurons in the brain, which are hardwired in us the ability to feel how other people react to stimuli. And as such, rather than being Homo economicus, could it be that we are in fact Homo empatheticus? Jeremy Rifkin, in his 2010 book, The Empathetic Civilization, discusses these mirror neurons at length, and he argues that they are proof that our desire to be social animals is part of our neurobiology. He argues vehemently that we are actually predisposed to empathy, and self-interest is actually a secondary force. Being empathetic is a critical part of anti-individualism in that it is a direct emotional connection between individuals that allows for shared experiences. The presence of mirror neurons actually help us do this. The connection between humans that are part of the same imagined community, as perhaps Benedict Anderson would have written about, is a tangible one, but obviously can be coerced and can be manipulated and stage managed by the state. So when we think ethically about anti-individualism, it requires us to question this sort of stage-managed collectivism, one that sort of disappears at the level of empathy. It requires us to feel the same as others, rather than simply be collectivized into it by a sort of external vanguard or some sort of hegemonic force. This is very different to being sympathetic, which is the recognition of someone else's feelings but no direct experience of them. It's easy to be sympathetic. Politicians always express sympathy. But the ethics of anti-individualism require more than that. They require more than recognition of someone else's disposition. It requires a direct experience of it. Mirror neurons help us to do this. By witnessing the actions and or the plight of others fires the same feelings in the viewer. So to be more empathetic requires more experience of this. Now clearly this is different across many different people. We have neurodiversity and neurodiverse systems of being. But across the human population, Rifkin argues that civilization allows empathy to appear, largely because we are now globally connected. And so therefore are empathetic responses. So while the sort of global hyperconnectivity of the world is being used to spread the ideology of competitiveness and self-interest and neoliberal capitalism far and wide into unfettered parts of the world. It is also allowing empathetic sensibilities to go global. Therefore, anti-individualism as an ethic rejects this globalization rhetoric of expansive neoliberalism and instead embraces planetary empathy. There are, of course, countless examples of this kind of empathetic response being played out across the world. Obviously, I would like to focus on one in particular. In the mid-2010s, Europe, as I'm sure all acutely aware, experienced the onset of quite a chronic refugee crisis, something which is still going on today. It saw millions of people fleeing geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East and in Africa. And obviously now it's kind of, well, had dissipated from the news. It's kind of back in what Turkey is doing. But it continues. Families are making highly dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean Sea. And if they survive, they're looking for new homes in European countries, many of which do not want them. Throughout 2014 and 2015, images of refugees were beamed across Europe and the world, and indeed they still are today. Many of the mainstream media outlets across Europe, but particularly those in the UK anyway, maintained a narrative of very much a nationalised self-interest. And clearly what happened with Brexit is kind of a culmination of that. These refugees were sort of depicted as economic migrants and racialised others. They were dehumanised by a political media narrative which viewed them as people to resist. Obviously couched within the discourse of austerity, the motivations were that these migrants were economised and they were coming upon us to take our jobs or burden our economy or our NHS or whatever it is. It was the marketised logic within the migrant crisis. However, on the 2nd of September in 2015, there was an image that was published across many of the news outlets of Alan Kurdi, who was a Syrian toddler, lying dead, face down on a beach in Turkey. This is an artistic representation. I didn't want to show the actual photo because it's obviously quite distressing. Because it was a shocking reminder of the plight of these refugees and actually generated a distinct shift in the media narrative, although whether it's carried on is another question. Research projects conducted on social media narratives of the refugee crisis around that time, actually before and after this image, found there to be a marked alteration in mood from large indifference beforehand to large-scale empathy after. The image of a dead child is clearly shocking, one that unequivocally induces emotions of grief, sickness, and desperation. Upon viewing it, no doubt our mirror neurons fired up, causing us to instantly feel immense grief, pain, and anguish. It was a key moment, at least I guess in the UK and with the UK specifically, that highlighted how global hyperconnectivity, in this case social media, can create an empathetic response that mobilises subsequent action. Because after that date, the number of volunteers who went to help in Turkey and in Greece and in other areas went up, skyrocketed, including myself to Calais. These people were largely spurred on by an empathetic response and a collectivised humanitarian response as well. And in so doing, they created actually a space of the commons. A commons that was both a physical place, such as Lesbos in Greece or Calais in northern France, as well as a virtual space, through a myriad of social media groups that shared information and sort of solidarity networks across Europe, which still go on today. I'm still part of the WhatsApp group which shares resources around Europe. So while being subjected to violence by the forces of a militarised capitalism and times of internal strife, a space of the commons where people of many religions, nationalities, classes, ethnicities and genders came to the fore, albeit under extremely intense violence. The way in which thousands of volunteers have operated as a loose collective of people over a long period of time maintain and continue to maintain a provision of aid that obviously feeds, clothes, shelters and serves many thousands of vulnerable people. This is an act of common. Such actions epitomise this sort of ethic of anti-individualism and is largely empathetic. It internalises the feelings of others into a common experience. So coming together as a form of sort of empathetic response is a critical part of this sort of anti-individualism and the commons that it hopes to create. And what's more, we have scientific evidence that now suggests that the human body can no longer be thought of as an individual at all. There has been a widely held belief in microbiological science that the human body is at home to at least 10 times more bacteria than there are cells in the human body. However, in recent years, large scientific studies have been initiated to research the so-called microbiome, which is, and I quote, the ecological community of commensal, symbiotic, and pathogenic microorganisms that literally share our body space. So more than simply living inside us, these microbes act as another organ of the human body that is as important to our day-to-day functioning as our heart, our liver, our spleen, or our brain. Purely by cell count, we are in fact only 10% human. The alien community of microbiota, is the term they use, can influence the kinds of foods that we crave, the way we communicate, and even the way we think and we feel. It has been discovered that some microbiota release toxins that alter the central nervous systems via chemical imbalance, specifically so that to make us crave and subsequently eat different kinds of food. The human body has 21,000 genes or so that all go towards making us who we are, but our microbiomes contain another 8 million genes which interact with our bodies, tweak our immune system, shift the workings of our guts and our brains, and generally help us to function. So our bodies are swarming with alien organisms, affecting the way we think, the way we move, and the way we interact with other humans. And what is more, the DNA within our cells is actually not our own in some cases. Obviously, it's passed down from our parents, who passed it on from theirs. But the very makeup of our genes is a product of the entire lineage of our ancestry, but also viral DNA. So whether viruses that exist in the world, which you're very aware of one at the moment, can be considered living organisms, is obviously still very much debated. I'm sure any of you who did biology at school know that viruses, obviously zombie viruses, whether they're living or they're dead. But the materiality infects human DNA, which is then sort of replicated via reproduction, and this process has been going on for millions and millions of years. Now, this is common medical science. It's called retroviruses, and they invade human cells, and they can infect our DNA and our production process. And so, along with this microbiome, we share our body space. I guess this is the point I'm trying to make, is that we share our body spaces with many other different forms of beings. So the presence of these other microorganisms in our bodies is obviously one thing, right? But having entirely whole human bodies, genetic material inside is obviously quite enough. Chimerism is the presence of one another, or another person's cell in another body, and obviously inspired the legendary work of H.R. Geiger. This chimerism is a common occurrence via blood transfusions, organ transplants, as well as how, when in the womb, our mother's immune system can attack that of her child, and the genetic material is sometimes swapped. And perhaps even more radically, it is not uncommon for the genetic code of an unborn twin to be present in the surviving child. Where one of the dizygotic or non-identical twins has not fully developed beyond the embryonic stage, their genes cross over into the other child, imprinting their external code in its entirety. In some extreme cases, it has been known that entire parasitic twins have been found on the abdomens of fully grown adults. Now, these are all very extreme examples. But what I'm trying to get at is that there's a lot of increasing biomedical evidence and research is leading many scientists to suggest that humans are part of a super organism. And we can no longer sort of delineate and bracket off any other kind of organism so readily. As has been suggested by a couple of psychiatrists, Peter Kramer and Paolo Bresson, they said, whereas our cohabitation with one another, or other organisms, may not pose a strong challenge to the commonly shared assumption that humans are unitary individuals, the presence of a large number and wide variety of such entities and the power they have on us renders this assumption untenable. We are not organisms, but superorganisms. It is time to change the very concept we have of ourselves and to realise that one human individual is neither just human nor just one individual. And any excuse to show this picture. You can see the Zygo film, Blomkamp, the little short. It's a science fiction monster movie where the monster's made up of all the dead parts of humans. Really quite, it's a very good film. It's very short and fun online. So the science of anti-individualism may not be a strong challenge, as they say, to the ingrained biomedical corpus of knowledge at present. And it may only be focused on the sort of micro-physical connectivity that renders humanity a superorganism. But if you couple this kind of thinking with leanings towards global empathy, and we're beginning to see the tangible realization of a global, connected, and collective sense of humanity, we can think of ourselves as kind of one global human body. Although that's not quite like that. Maybe quite like that. Now, this metaphor is not as prosaic as it sounds, okay? So to think of humanity as a collective global body radically alters how we relate to one another. It shifts the way to shift the way that we relate to other human beings as people to whom we are intimately connected is to renounce self-interest as the guiding force of society. But the traditional view of the human body is one that kind of implies a hierarchy. A human body usually features a brain, a heart, lungs, and so on. But it organises the body. What if we rethought the body without organs? Now, this is something that the philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari have done in their concept of the body without organs. But very simply, it's an abstract metaphor kind of for a more equitable, radically connected and progressive society. It is one that is decentered, non-individualized, and works completely differently to the prevailing order of life. The body without organs necessitates radical connectivity, one that actively shuns kind of organisation, top-down organisation. It therefore dismantles the self and has no permanent organisation. Organs, in this instance, are created as and when needed, but it's not an organism of any kind. It is always combining, decombining, and recombining to effect ongoing change to the status quo. It shares a philosophical language with common precisely because it is how anti-individualism can work by relentless connectivity to create different modes of societal being beyond self-interested competition. So, thinking in the abstract is not always helpful, so let's give an example. So, in Calais, when I was doing all this humanitarian work and still involved remotely, the response was to help refugees in Greece, and it was in Calais. It was a long process of kind of empathetic anti-individualism that spanned time and space. People from different nations, regions, organised donations, drop-offs, food and clothes and tents, blankets. And the entire operation really was a body without organs. These organs appeared when needed, i.e. collection points, food delivery systems, but not an organisation with any long-lasting centralised control. The body without organs in this instance had effected far more positive change in the various camps over Europe, with many of the established official NGOs being completely useless in this case, because they just take too long to mobilise. The body without organs was far more effective in this case, because it was mobile, it was quick. Now, such radical connectivity is kind of vitally important, I think, in maintaining this ethnic harmony. This is because self-centred competitiveness, under the guise of neoliberal capitalism, is always kind of there in the background, waiting for the chance to label someone as some sort of heroic individual, putting others before themselves. Anti-individualism can result in deleterious egoism if those radical connections begin to wane. The conditions of capitalism are such that the reward for heroic individualism increase as anti-capitalism progresses. Put crudely, I guess, people can set out, or once subversive ideas can become co-opted, not unlike this rather crass protest chic movement in Karl Lagerfeld created. This sort of co-option by capitalist discourse is only really too quick to pounce on sort of heroic individuals who are resisting the system. Indeed, advertising companies, brand initiatives, and PR agencies constantly seek out people that would make their product stand out in the crowded marketplace. And what better way to do that than to co-opt the image of resistive behaviour? And also, being selfless on your own can result in exhaustion and burnout, something I'm sure we're all far too familiar with. Relentlessly being empathetic and helping others without kind of communal support that nourishes the self results in massive depletion of emotional and physical resources. Sometimes self-love is critical. Again, there are countless examples of lone activists who eventually succumb to fatigue, mental illness, and breakdown. I've seen it far too often. For those refugees and volunteers working in the camps across Europe, something as simple like the lack of sleep or the constant attempts to satisfy the needs of all those who ask, but also those self-centered desires like finding a warm, comfortable bed and a hot shower. They all threaten to derail the commoning practice. However, it was through a collaboration that these threats were mostly overcome. Other, perhaps less tired people stepping in to help, words of actions and encouragement, a simple hug goes a long way. The chance to rest and have lunch with friends and other refugees. There have been countless examples in that instance and many others across the world of how a radical connectivity across a continent brought about the revocation of anti-individualism. So to effectively engage in the act of creative anti-individualism and to build a world outside of capitalist realism requires a radical resistance to the dominant civilizing force of self-centered competition. In its latest incarnation, which is kind of neoliberal capitalism with an authoritarian twist, has exacerbated the conditions of self-interest by increasing the reward of greed, by centralizing wealth even further, increasing inequality, and reducing the ability of a common world to flourish. So the first step in building the commons and effect more social justice is to inculcate an ethics of anti-individualism and a science of togetherness that seeks to be selfless and empathetic with others. And what is more, this allows us to sort of radically connect with others to maintain this anti-individualism, to stave off co-option, and to rescue people from burnout. It is by being together, free from a marketized transaction, that we create a productive energy that can flourish in the face of co-option and appropriation by capitalism. Now, such energy is emergent, it's always in flux, and it's elusive. But by simply being together and open to connection and careful with each other, we can be dangerous together. Thank you.